Good morning, afternoon, or evening, where in the world you are, and welcome to Gender and Digital Health webinar series. The topic of the session today, which is the 8th session in the series, is Women's Social Media Networks, Movements, and Implications for Health, and we have an impressive lineup of panelists. The Gender and Digital Health webinar series is a platform to foster new partnerships and co-create knowledge on the gender dimensions of digital health, with a focus on translation of evidence to policy and practice-based learning in low and middle-income countries. The series are organized by a consortium between the United Nations University, the International Institute for Global Health, the University of Cape Town, and BBC Media Action. The recordings of the previous sessions can be accessed on the Gender and Health Hub, in our website, or in our YouTube channel. So feel free to tweet your thoughts, comments, or reflections, but please use the hashtag GHHTalks or Gender Digital Health, and please introduce yourself in the chat and ask questions. So we have here the different webinars that we had up to September. We still have 3 more to go. And we also invite you to participate in our workshop in November of a deep dive into designing process evaluations with a gender lens. So when you register for the webinars the first time, you will receive updates and invitations to subsequent webinars or events. We have the webinar organizers, and our moderator today is Sarah Chamberlain. Sarah is the digital director for BBC Media Action in India, where she is responsible for designing and scaling mobile services for low literate and low income communities. She has been at the forefront of digital communications in the development sector for 23 years, including 14 years spent designing and scaling mobile services in Asia. Her digital solutions have benefited millions of people and won many awards, including the 3 GSMA Global Mobile Awards, a Microsoft Education Award, and the Gold and Bronze Cyber Lions at the Cannes International Advertising Award, and 2 BAFTA nominations. Sarah has designed and delivered digital capacity building programs for NGOs in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, India, Pakistan, the Palestinian territories, and Sri Lanka, and has published widely. Sarah, thank you for moderating the session today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Claudia. It's wonderful to be here today. Most of today's speakers will be sharing emerging results from a series of landscaping studies that BBC Media Action has conducted as part of the Digital Women's Economic Empowerment Project in India, which I've had the privilege of leading. It's a 3-year research and learning project that aims to identify how digital can strengthen pathways to women's empowerment and collectives without making existing inequalities worse. Our findings have significant implications for organizations seeking to use social media to improve health outcomes among women. For example, health education efforts. I'd now like to introduce the architect of the Digital We project, Yamini Atmavilas at the Gates Foundation. Yamini is a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation in India, with 17 plus years experience of research and evaluation in gender, women's work, migration, public health, and women's empowerment, and 7 years experience in research and program incubation and management in the philanthropic sector. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yamini. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Sarah, and congratulations to all of you for this webinar. Sounds so exciting, and I'm really looking forward to being part of this. I'll keep my remarks extremely short because I'm very eager to get to our speakers and to hear what they've been learning. Maybe I'll start with 2 or 3 organizing principles that should be framing our thinking and our conversation. And as I see it, the speakers are all going to hit some of these parameters. The first is there's no, it goes without saying that we are living in a world that's becoming increasingly digital in some way or the other. And the question is then, how inclusive is this digital world? What is that proliferation of tools, technologies, phones, how does that create opportunities? Who does it create opportunities for? Who's included? How are we all positioned vis-a-vis that thing that we call digital, which is itself an extremely complex, multifaceted thing, and whose voices are getting privileged within those digital spaces, and perhaps on a more nuanced level, what are the conversations that are happening there? The second big question for me is, what's the quality of experience of people in the digital world? And some of our speakers are going to hit, some very, very important and pretty intense experiences, positive as well as not so positive, on what that quality of experience feels like. The third, probably the more fundamental question is, digital is a system like any other. So where does power lie? How is it organized? And how do we as a society organize ourselves in this world that is becoming increasingly digital? How are, for example, physical experiences, networks, people, relationships, what do they look like when they go digital or when they start to use digital? Does it give us the opportunity to transcend boundaries of space, place, person, remoteness, physical geography, identity, to expand? What are the pros and cons of that? And how do people really get heard, and what kind of change can digital really bring? So with that, I just say, digital is both a wonderful enabler, as well as potentially divider if we're not paying attention to some of these questions and these principles. It goes without saying that for a country like India, digital provides a huge opportunity. Definitely in the pandemic, we have had many, many stories of resilience, connectedness, conversations, a real desire and a real ability and a need to go digital. Digital has been used to locate people. Digital has been used for people to connect with one another. Some of us work a lot more digitally, and potentially organize society and organize relief in ways that potentially would not have been possible otherwise. At the same time, we also know that from a bottom-up approach, the role of social norms, gender norms, other kinds of economic and social stratifications have definitely structure our interface with digital, and probably define both the opportunities as well as limits, and vice versa, that digital provides its own sort of way of structuring society, and perhaps helps us graduate out of some forms of inequality while potentially putting us in another set of inequalities and another set of relationships. Now, with that, it's very exciting to be part of this particular webinar that's really talking about social networks, something that's very dear to my heart, and definitely where the foundation has been working very closely, trying to build on women's collectives and see, what are the potential interventions for women's agency and networking and empowerment that is possible when we can leverage women's networks, and in a way that preserves those networks. A lot of research shows that, for example, skilling, agency building, confidence building happens better in peer groups when people are networked with one another, when they're together. And I think the pandemic has really posed those challenges of how people can come together for these ends, and digital is offering some ways that can be transcended, and we look forward to sort of seeing what those interconnections might look like. So without much ado, let me just voice over what who our speakers are and what they will be talking about. Sarah will moderate this, but I will hand over in about a minute. So our first set of speakers are Ambika Tandon and Ayush Rati, who will talk about how the gender divide in India is extremely pronounced on social media. They will talk about what that looks like, and really call into question efforts that use social media as a tool for health education, particularly among low literate, low income rural women. A second sort of dimension of this particular question is, although wealth, education are traditionally, what we talk about in terms of determinants of mobile ownership and mobile usage and having the kind of capital to transact in the digital world, there's also increasing recognition of how gender norms play a huge role, not just in society, in our interrelationships with one another, like physically and in the analog world, but also in the digital world. Our second speaker, Anita Gurumurthy, will share results of a study that her organization, ID for Change, has just completed on gender hate speech on Twitter. Now, how do we work on digital then? So designing social media strategies for women's empowerment then requires a lot more thinking about ways that, how do we mitigate existing inequalities, not exacerbate them, and not expose women to gender-based violence online. And this is something that we hope Anita's presentation will give us a lot more to think about. Our third speaker is Dr. Eric Rice, who will talk about social network analysis. So basically using a social network analysis approach and a methodology for looking at what do women's social networks look like in rural India, as well as other geographies that he's worked in, and quantitatively sort of measuring the value of those networks. And I think I sort of said myself that peer networks are among the strongest enablers of positive, social change and the positive experience of learning for women. But what is that quality? What is that quality of network? And what are the dimensions of those networks that can actually, foster positive change and positive experience in the lives of women, especially in face of, our own intent to facilitate women's empowerment and digital adoption. And finally, our friend Dr. Olanda Ruthven, will talk about how digital social movements and campaigns for social justice and women's empowerment in North America have been leveraging social media, the strengths and weaknesses of these approaches, and what are some implications of those strategies and those experiences for organizing and for women's collectives in the global South. So with that, I congratulate the organizers again and hand over to Sarah to usher us through this very exciting evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yamini, for that powerful introduction and, for discussing both the digital opportunity, which, as you've said, is huge in India, but also for asking questions about the digital risks, the risk of digital, particularly, for example, the role of gender norms, and asking that really vital question, whose voices are being amplified online and why? And I think our next speakers are going to talk about and give us some answers to that really crucial question. So over to you, Ambika and Ayush. Let's, if we could change the slide, thank you. So Ambika and Ayush are both senior researchers at the Center for Internet and Society. Ambika focuses on the impact of digital technology on gender and social inequality. And Ayush writes on the social legal aspects of digital, covering a wide range of subjects, including access, labor, and social justice. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. What Ambika and I will be doing today is presenting insights from a landscaping study on social media and chat applications in India. in the context of women's empowerment that we had conducted for BBC Media Action's Digital Women's Economic Empowerment Project. Next slide, please. The study was conceptualized building on the hypothesis that digital platforms and tools can be used to strengthen pathways to women's empowerment through increased access to social, financial, and human capital, and can also be used to organize and mobilize women's collectives. To be able to test this hypothesis, we felt the need to first focus on the potential and risks of women's collectives using social media platforms and chat applications to mobilize and organize their members. Next slide, please. To do so, we looked at 4 themes that we expect will help design robust digital interventions to support women's empowerment. As the first theme, we sought to scope out the contours of women's digital access in India. We looked at mobile use, internet use, and social media use. For the second theme, we unpacked the dynamics of digital groups, focusing on what makes successful digital groups click. For the third theme, we sought to understand the strategies that influencers with sizable women's following adopt and engage in their following. And to better understand women's behavior online, as the fourth theme, we also looked at gender norms and risks that influence women's access to and use of digital spaces. Next slide, please. To start with, the gender gap in access to mobile devices in India is quite well known. This gap, while dwindling, continues to be extremely significant. What we also wanted to do was look beyond access and ask the pertinent questions around what actually happens after a woman gains ownership of a mobile phone. What we found is that there are gender gaps in the number and complexity of tasks performed on a mobile phone. While the gender gap in average tasks performed does not appear stark, the difference between 5 and 7 here, even after rounding up, does not appear too stark. We find that this gap widens with increases in task complexity. Thus, a quick conclusion that we can draw here is that it's not enough to provide women access to devices, and much more work needs to be done around the next step in the digital journey. Next slide, please. So one such gap in mobile use that we identify is that in internet use. Mobile is the preferred form of internet access in India, and it's no surprise then that the gender gap in mobile access also leads to a wide gender gap in internet use as well. This gap persists across age groups and is quite pronounced within adolescents as well. A sizable urban-rural gap in internet use also exists, and women in rural India are least likely to be using the internet. Next slide, please. Now, these demographic variances map onto social media use as well. Generally speaking, the likelihood of social media use rises with increases in levels of education and income. The share of social media users outside the 6 metropolitan areas of India has been on the rise over the last few years, though. Our interactions with social media representatives indicates that certain platforms, including YouTube, experience more traffic now from outside the metro cities than within the metro cities. In fact, prior to the ban on TikTok use, the platform was also notable in prompting greater levels of usage from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Next slide, please. Now, age too is an important demographic factor determining social media use. Interestingly, the UDIGH survey conducted by Population Council found that the likelihood of social media use decreases with increase in age. However, some of the most pronounced gender gaps are in the adolescent age category. Next slide, please. The slide after this. Yeah, thank you. Age too is an important demographic. Women's usage of social media is also highly platform specific. Snapchat is the only platform with gender parity, and there are sizable gender gaps on all other platforms, with Twitter being the least preferred by women internet users. In fact, although smartphone ownership among adult women in India grew from 14 to 25% during the pandemic, the percentage of women users on Facebook remained static and actually declined on Twitter. Now, this raises important questions regarding the design of platforms specifically and of digital spaces broadly. I mean, across many of the data points I've discussed thus far, there have been unprecedented improvements prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it remains to be seen whether these sustain. I will now hand over to Ambika to take you through the rest of our work.
Thanks, Ayush. So, as Ayush discussed, even in the face of a multitude of restrictions and barriers, some women do gain access to social media. However, they still do not have an equitable experience, as can be seen in the differences in the behavior of men and women across digital applications. So, to talk about social media, women users report being at the receiving end of gender-based violence and sexual harassment, which often deters them from using these platforms entirely or constrains their use in various ways. Women also use strategies to avoid being targeted or identified, including adopting masculine identities while participating on social media or other public spaces. Gender norms also impact the use of chat applications, as we have been discussing, and digital groups in particular. So women are more likely to use private groups and other digital platforms to engage with people that are already known to them. Public groups that are based on interests, identity affiliation, such as caste and hometowns, are more likely to be male dominated. And here public groups, by public groups I'm referring to digital groups on applications such as Facebook and WhatsApp. Where present in such groups, women are more likely to post less, and moderators and in-group influencers are almost always men. So this also impacts outcomes. Although public groups increase networks, access to information, and strengthen offline relationships, women are often excluded from these benefits unless digital groups are designed specifically for women. Next slide, please. So we also found it useful to go a bit deeper into content creation, not just consumption, to leverage social media for women's empowerment. This is because the rise of social media influencers has shifted the landscape of content creation away from just traditional celebrities to include native social media influencers who have gained a following just through content creation, reflecting a possible democratization of influence through social media. So we argue that for women's economic collectives, this could reflect two layers of possibilities. One, for women from marginalized groups to become influencers themselves and bring visibility to their voices through social media. And two, for behavioral change campaigns to leverage social media influencers to engage women with access to these platforms. To explore these possibilities, we studied the landscape of influencer marketing in India and find that although Instagram and YouTube influencers are more likely to be from urban and high income groups, short video apps do have influencers from rural and middle to low income groups. Influencers from the latter group have gained a large following and monetized their presence through TikTok, VMate and Likey, all of which were unfortunately Chinese apps that were banned last year. And these groups have now splintered across Indian apps such as Moj, Josh and MX Takatak, but the usage of these apps is still not high enough for influencers to monetize and actually gain a living through this profession. Key platforms for influencer marketing are now Instagram and YouTube. Influencers on Instagram are balanced between men and women, while YouTube has a higher proportion of men. Critically, content creation is gender segregated, so women dominate fields such as lifestyle and fashion, while men dominate technology and sports. There are several examples of women who are breaking such stereotypes and entering fields dominated by men. So we found several examples, including an adolescent who had become famous for her fast bowling skills in Srinagar, and a businesswoman who had gained a following giving financial advice about stock markets. However, if users perceive women to be too outspoken or sexualized and thereby stepping outside the bounds of what they consider appropriate behavior for women, then they do tend to face backlash and harassment. Next slide, please. So we take the case study.
You're at 9 minutes and 30 seconds.
Right.
Go ahead.
So we take the case study of Khabar Lahariya, a grassroots women-led publication to illustrate the potential of social media and chat apps. KL uses both social media, mainly YouTube and Instagram, and chat applications to grow their networks and disseminate their content. They also use hyperlocal digital groups to identify content and relevant stories. They have successfully leveraged social media as a means to bring more visibility to women reporters from rural parts of Uttar Pradesh, whose voices and stories find little to no representation on their own terms in mainstream news and discourse. Reporters from KL have publicly spoken about the harassment they face from within their network and community, as they are perceived to be performing roles that are not appropriate for women. And they have been forced to adopt strategies such as ignoring negative comments or reporting mechanisms on platforms to deal with such harassment, but they do continue to use social media to grow their following. Next slide, please. So I'll end here by outlining some recommendations we have identified for designing interventions for women's economic collectives using social media and chat apps. So the first set of recommendations are around paying attention to gender when designing using digital tools or platforms. Women users display different behavior than men and have different levels of access, which needs to be accounted for in intervention design. The second set of recommendations is around leveraging digital groups. Using private groups and closed platforms is important to ensure women feel comfortable and safe. And active and federated moderation can ensure that the content shared is relevant to group members and engagement remains high. Behavioral change campaigns to leverage social media influencers can also be successful in engaging women with access to social media, and critically also engaging men on women's empowerment issues. I'll end there.
So Sarah, just to flag as you're coming off of mute, you have a couple of burning questions. So there's 3 total questions that I see. 2 are sort of clarifications, and I wonder if you'd like me to read them now, or
I think could we hold them to the end, because
sure.
And so thank you all for posting. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Ambika, maybe if you and Ayush could also try to answer some in the Q&A directly,
sure.
and we'll hold over any others for the next discussion.
Yeah.
Over to you, Sarah.
And thank you so much, Ayush and Ambika, for that really compelling presentation. It's particularly striking, I thought, that only 5% of rural people with no education or only a primary education are using social media in India today. And I think, as your design recommendations suggest, this means that anyone considering using social media, for example, for health education to reach low income, low literate populations, needs to really think carefully about whether that's the most appropriate channel. I was also really struck by the data point you shared from the Population Council's UDAYA survey in UP and Bihar, which showed that only 5% of 15 to 19-year-old girls in these states are using social media. And I think, again, that really contradicts a sort of perception that I've heard a lot, that young people are all on social media, and it's really older people who aren't using social media because they're sort of, they're not digital natives. But I think this survey really pretty clearly indicates that, digital natives may be a higher income, more urban phenomena, is what this data suggests. I think it's also really striking, as you said, that the percentage of women using Facebook has actually remained static during the pandemic, despite this massive increase in women using mobile phones. And the percentage of women using Twitter has actually fallen by 50%. So from 4% to, well, not quite 50, 4% to 8% of its user base in India is women. And I think that really we need to ask, why are women turning away from social media platforms, particularly platforms such as Twitter? And I think our next speaker, Anita Gurumurthy, is going to give us some insights into why this might be happening. Next slide, please. So Anita is the executive director for IT for Change. She also founded IT for Change, and she leads research on the platform economy, data and AI governance, democracy in the digital age, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. Anita actively engages in national and international advocacy on digital rights. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you very much. Can I have the first slide? Yes, so this is really based on a study we are just about closing up. And so the report is not yet out, but it gives me a pleasure to share the results here also because of the complexity of what really happens to women's public political participation online and what do we do about it, exactly like the research that was just presented. This is a study about hateful and abusive speech directed at women in the public sphere that we define within the Indian jurisdiction. And this is the data that is based on scraping Twitter in 1 week in late 2020. And we decided to go with Twitter because we felt that the platformized public sphere with its promise for voice and for kind of political engagement is extremely vital. And to really look at it closely and look at how such an important site where women can exercise the right to public participation and freedom of expression, how really social relations and norms pan out here would be important. What we thought while we decided to really tweak the methodology of the study is to look at not just the scale and incidence of online abuse, but also to explore the nature and quality of the abuse. So we looked at a mixed method exploration of online hate to capture this and to bring out what kinds of abuse women face, particularly women in political life face, and what could be done about it. Next slide, please. So as I said, we included members of parliament, members of the legislative assemblies in the states, currently holding office as people in power, women in active politics, formerly involved in electoral party politics, but not currently in office, and women political commentators who are not necessarily affiliated to political parties, but active contributors to public political discourse online. And then we created a representative sample across the axes of caste, religion, age, and geography. And this, kind of complex selection process resulted in our shortlisting 20 women. And we were very keen to also identify people with a high engagement rate online, which we thought was an important criterion as it would provide us better insights when we scrape the data. We did a kind of inductive coding process. So we developed, initially we did a kind of download and then started coding. And based on that, we looked at 22 different types of nuances of problematic content or abusive content. And then we also, when we finally did code, we looked at one tweet and said, this could be categorized under a maximum of 3 different mutually exclusive codes. For people who may be from India and who are interested, when the report comes out, we will have the names of those. We're thinking through the ethics of this. It's extremely important that these are public documents out there in the public domain, these tweets, but we also think that it's important to contemplate a little bit on the ethics of outing the names. The next slide, please. Yeah. What I wanted to point out is the terminologies and definitions, and this is how we did not go with the way in which platforms define these categories, because different platforms, including Facebook, for instance, in their internal policies, have different ways to capture misinformation, hateful speech, abusive speech, etc. So we, because time is limited here, these slides are anyway there with the organizers. This is one set, and the next slide. Yeah, so we also had these innumerable classifications, each with a particular nuance, because we did not want to collapse them in the first instance. Next slide. So finally, we actually had a total of 7 categories, which captured very discrete lines of attacks on women. And so you see abuse, misogyny, caste-based hate speech, sexualized references, religious hate speech, threat, and othering. Next slide, please. What I wanted to say is that we found that this is disturbing, so I just wanted to caution people that the next couple of slides might really be very violent. Partly this is owing to the fact that women, when they put themselves out as having or wielding political power, seem to invite a lot of abuse. So the first is something that dehumanizes them, equates them to an animal. The second, as you can see, is an example of deep hatefulness for women, misogyny. The third captures an Indianism of a particular caste order, which refers to a politician, uses the word chamar, which is caste-based, and also uses the word corrupt, thereby conflating the two. Next. There were sexualized references of this, and this is just, remember, this is just tweets captured over a week. So, and of a certain intensity that is very, very pervasive. There was religious hate speech, references to othering as well in the religious hate speech, because there's constantly this charge of not being Indian enough, a threat that somebody would burn your house down, and othering, which is that you belong to a gang that will break the national polity. Next. Yeah, so I'll quickly go through, I'm already on 6 minutes, 30 seconds. I'd go to the findings. I think here is where we have to step back a little bit and see what's happening. It's not like a homogenized, flat discourse of hate against women, but it's actually something that's indicative of a particular form of hate. And before I come to that, broadly, what we found is that ubiquity of online gender-based hate across the political ideological spectrum. It didn't really matter whether you're from the ruling party or not, whether you're left-leaning or not. But if you're perceived to be left-leaning, then you certainly got insulted a little bit more. Also, there was a certain herd aggression, a pile-on effect. And, you know, when there was one troll, there were several. Abusive speech directed at women politicians were also taking the form of gendered attacks on their bodies. And rarely did it have anything to do with their actual work as politicians. While women from positions of relative privilege did receive abuse, the hate observed to be intersectional, was observed to be intersectional in nature. So you actually saw a disproportionate amount of hate in our sample directed at Muslim women. And the amount of hate received also varied depending on your location in the political field. So if you didn't have any formal party backing and you were just a political commentator in that field, then you received most instances of hate. So next slide, please. I just wanted to spend the last couple of minutes just situating this because we may not really have the time to go into what do we do about this, because it's an acutely culturally embedded sociological problem that is aggravated and by the fact of virality in the public sphere. So what we really found is that all these patterns fit into a certain cultural trope, and that is that of a certain distinct South Asian flavor of patriarchy and misogyny. And we could actually see attendant tropes and discernible patterns of abusive behavior that have been noted even in the pre-digital era as a part of that particular social contract or sexualized social contract between men and women. So there is this recurrent theme of shame and honor. There is caste-based hate, which was conspicuous by its absence in our sample, but it's perhaps also because of a deliberate erasure, we think, in a post-caste ideology that is often propagated by the current dispensation in power. There were references to very highly problematic South Asian categories of the love jihad, whereby it is accused, men of a particular community are accused to oftentimes seducing women from the majority community. Extreme policing of women's sexuality, and also in many ways, women who are single being trolled on account of being single and accused of being sexually deprived. So I think I would go to the last slide and end my presentation there. I think we really need to unpack this. We need to destabilize the idea and concept of violence. This is really not just about particular forms of aggression, but something that happens day on day on day. And this needs to be situated in the form of censorship that occurs in a culturally contextual way within South Asia. And these are not then individualized acts of aberration. They're very much patriarchal constructions of gender identity and power. A new trope of the online male entitled in his abuse and emboldened by the valorization of the toxic masculinist ideal. And I think really the legitimacy to this is something we have to question. It's partly, of course, and in a large part being endorsed by the political establishment. And here we need to also acknowledge, and this is my last point, in our regulatory frameworks, the fact that the platform becomes part of your structural reality. So it's not the platform that is outside of a culture or society, but the viral, algorithmified, automated public sphere is very much part of the structural reality which reinforces social norms. So I will end here and take questions later on.
Thank you so much, Anita, for sharing the emerging findings from this really critical research. It viscerally illustrates why women may be turning away from social media platforms such as Twitter. I mean, just the scope and variability and, the wealth of different types of abuse online, as a woman, it's really pretty frightening and intimidating. So, given how toxic gender norms appear to be online, and I hasten to add, not just in India. I mean, as we'll hear later from one of our speakers, Orlando Riven, backlash online is a phenomenon that's happening all over the world, and women who speak out are having to contend with this in most countries. But given this environment, this online environment, why should the development sector be interested in social media? I mean, you kind of have to ask, right? So how can we really better understand and measure the positive and negative values of digital social movements, or rather digital social networks? Our next speaker is going to talk about research methodologies for investigating social networks, including online, and is going to share the results of research that we did together in India to understand how collectives are positively using digital technology for collective organizing. So our next speaker is Dr. Eric Rice. Eric, thank you so much for joining us this early morning from California. Eric is an associate professor and co-director of the USC Center for Artificial Intelligence in Society. Eric has a BA from the University of Chicago, an MA and PhD in sociology from Stanford. He was a postdoc fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles, and he joined the USC faculty in 2009. In 2012, he received the John B. Reed Early Career Award through the Society for Prevention Research. He specializes in social network science and theory, as well as community-based research. And I just wanted to highlight that Eric is, I think, fairly unique or interestingly placed in that he works extensively on understanding digital social networks and using artificial intelligence to do so. But he is based in the social work department at USC, and his focus is on social work, and his background is in sociology. So it's a very unique mix of skills that Eric brings to his research. So over to you, Eric.
Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, or from my perspective, at least, to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you today to discuss women's economic empowerment in India from the perspective of social network analysis and social capital theory. As a starting point, it's important to acknowledge that as soon as we are talking about digital telecommunication technologies, social media, and the like, we're inherently discussing social network phenomenon. I believe that we need to move beyond asking questions such as how many women have access to what kind of technology or how many women are using what social media platforms. I think we need to begin to ask, how do these technologies impact social networks? We need to ask, how are social networks changing or being leveraged by technology in the context of women's empowerment collectives or WECs? I believe that there's much to be learned from both social network theory, particularly social capital theory, as well as social network analysis. Now, social network analysis may not be something that's familiar to everyone, so let me just define it quickly. Social network analysis is a set of quantitative methods, sort of similar to statistics, that allow us to quantify and model the patterns of connections among a group of people and the actions taken within those connections. These methods and theories that accompany them can help us to understand the opportunities presented by digital technology and the context of women's networks. Can you go to the next slide, please? Actually, I should have said that before this. Could we go to the next slide after this, please? Thanks. I'm going to start by talking about social capital theory. It's helpful to think about social capital theory in relationship to other forms of capital. So first of all, there's physical capital. That's money or natural resources. The second kind of capital that we should consider is human capital, which is individual capacities or skills. For example, education, intelligence, or a specific skill such as accounting. Now, social capital, however, is a third form of capital, is a set of resources that are possessed by a community, which are shared across network ties. The access to and use of these resources is something which an individual does in the context of a social network. It's important to bear in mind that there are several types of social capital, and I'll describe two of them today. The first is bonding capital. Now, bonding capital is a type of social capital that is shared by people within a particular community, usually who occupy very similar social positions. Now, bonding capital can create social solidarity, but if the network is very resource poor, there are really limits to the benefits of this type of capital. And as I'll discuss momentarily, if the network is a negative one, bonding capital can actually be detrimental. The second type of social capital that we should consider is bridging capital. So bridging capital is social capital that people share across a heterogeneous set of network ties. A classic example of bridging capital in action is when someone's looking for a new job. We often find out about new opportunities for work, not from our closest network ties, but rather from people who are acquaintances or even friends of friends. And as I'll show momentarily, in resource-poor communities, bridging capital to ties outside of that community can be critical for economic empowerment. Now, all of this may sound very abstract, so I think it's helpful for us to turn to a specific case. So if you could go to the next slide, please. For the past 20 years or so, I've conducted several studies in Los Angeles looking into the networks of youth who are experiencing homelessness. So like women in rural India, youth experiencing homelessness are profoundly lacking resources and are in need of economic empowerment. In the context of these studies, we used social network data and social network analysis to quantify and capture these network phenomenon. So what we found was that youth who have more connections to other street youth, so that is higher levels of that bonding social capital, were less likely to use employment services, for example. And so that's to say that the bonding capital was actually detrimental to youth's economic empowerment. If we go to the next slide, please. On the other hand, bridging social capital, particularly to family members who are not homeless or to social workers, which is what's pictured here, this was positively associated with the use of employment services, for example. So bridging capital, that is the network ties outside of the streets, augmented economic empowerment. And it's important to the current project that we also found that digital technologies, particularly cell phones and social media, consistently were critical to the maintenance of this bridging capital. So we go to the next slide, please. So now this brings me to the work which I did with BBC Media Action in late 2019. And what we'll share today is documented in a report that's just been released by BBC Media Action. You can see the link to the report on this slide. And Arjun, if you could please share the report with everyone else in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. This work included 14 focus groups and 12 individual interviews with a total of 229 persons in women's empowerment collectives in 6 locations in Madhya Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. The WECs were a mix of self-help groups, joint liability cooperatives, and trade unions. The supporting institutions included SRLM and Chaitanya Wise in Madhya Pradesh, and Reed and 2 women's trade unions in Tamil Nadu. If you could go to the next slide, please. So conceptually, what we saw is depicted in these social network diagrams. So as women became more involved in WECs and gained more access to digital technologies, their networks appeared to be expanding from local in-law-based social networks to larger, more expansive networks. Bonding capital was being augmented by bridging capital. And the bridging capital was primarily to women from more affluent social backgrounds who worked in the WEC supporting federations. In some cases, what we observed were very empowered women whose networks had expanded to include not only these key staff, but also hundreds of other women in large WEC supported networks. If we could go to the next slide, please, I'll start to discuss some of the specific findings from our fieldwork. So first, we observed women in the context of a relatively new and underdeveloped set of WECs. We asked all the women in this particular room who had a phone with them to hold it up. And as you can see in this photo, we saw very little access to digital technology. These women reported mostly bonding capital where they were interacting with other low resource women, and empowerment was only beginning to emerge in these groups. If we could go to the next slide, please. By contrast, we saw women who were supported by Chaitanya Wise in Madhya Pradesh, where digital access and empowerment was markedly greater. We met women who saw cell phones as critical to their daily lives. They were using their cell phones to engage in important economic activities. So we saw cooks, weavers, and stitch workers who were all using their phones to connect with customers. And we also saw younger women using mobile technology to facilitate educational activities. If you could go to the next slide, please. The most impressive work we saw in Madhya Pradesh was being done by 2 local women pictured here who had been trained by Chaitanya Wise to be self-help group organizers. These women were tapping into bridging capital. They both had strong connections to other women in the Chaitanya Wise staff who were from more affluent social backgrounds than these 2 women pictured here. The connections of the 2 women pictured here were to these Chaitanya Wise staff, and these connections were critical to their expanding opportunities. And what we observed was truly inspiring. These 2 women had created dozens of self-help groups, each one of them, which had about 10 members each. So these 2 women who themselves began their journey in very small in-law focused networks were now actively connected to hundreds of women. Their empowerment was palpable. In one case, we even met some in-laws who gushed with pride about their empowered daughter-in-law. And of course, digital technology was at the heart of all of this activity. The women told us how they actively used WhatsApp with their coworkers and with the women in the self-help groups that they had helped to organize. If you could go to the next slide, please. In the context of some more mature WECs, empowerment extended even beyond economic activity. So the leadership of some federations, for example, these leaders of a federation of about 2,000 Dalit women supported by Reed in Tamil Nadu are using digital effectively for collective engagement around public service delivery. So first of all, I want you to notice that unlike in the first picture I showed from the fieldwork where very few women had mobile phones, when we asked this group to hold up their phones, all of them had a mobile. And if we could go to the next slide. So these are some of the faces of digital empowerment. These women in particular were actively using their mobile phones to document local issues around public services. For example, we were told a story by one woman who used her smartphone to video huge lines at hospitals with insufficient medical staff. We also heard women describing using their mobiles to document schools with broken facilities, sewage spills, and the like. They used these images to effectively work with local government to improve the public service delivery in their communities. If we could go to the next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I want to leave you with some thoughts captured in this diagram. So in the context of WECs, empowerment appears to be closely tied to both digital access and the expansion of social networks. Digital access is not a prerequisite for empowerment, But it is also the case in rural India that a certain level of empowerment seems to be a starting point for digital access. So that's to say that what we observed was this complex interaction between emerging empowerment and digital access. In some cases, digital access led to empowerment, and in other cases, empowerment seemed to lead to digital access. So network theories and network analysis allow us to understand and document these social processes. And in so doing, what we can do is we can identify naturally occurring social processes, which hopefully we can leverage to create new programs and new interventions, which can then accelerate and augment empowerment. So thank you very much for listening this morning.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Eric. And I thought your point about we need to move beyond just measuring digital access and use and skill and start trying to better understand the value, both positive and negative, that those social network ties might provide is really important. And I think the other point that you made about how, although women's groups in remote areas of rural India are very good at creating bonding capital, i.e. providing social support, trust, and cohesion, really a sort of sisterhood to the women in the group, they may have a lot less access to bridging capital, which, access to new ideas, new opportunities, and new ways of doing things. And that network expansion within a wider collective, a wider social network, a federated structure may be really crucial to empowerment. And I think our next speaker, Dr. Orlando Riven, is going to take this conversation forward to really look at how social movements and campaigns for social justice and women's empowerment have been using digital in quite meaningful ways in both South America and North America. So over to you, Orlando. Or first of all, let me introduce Orlando. So Dr. Orlando Riven is an independent researcher and practitioner. She's based in Delhi, and she works in the areas of skills, labor standards, and social movements. Currently, other than this study, she's engaged with the Population Council to support a life skills initiative in secondary schools in Bihar. And prior to this, she worked for several years with Graham Vani. She tries to write and publish whenever possible and has a PhD in development studies from Oxford University. Over to you, Orlando.
Thank you, Sarah. Am I audible? I hope so. Is it clear? Yeah.
Yes, you are. You are.
Great. Thank you. Good evening from Delhi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. Could we have the first slide? Here in India, women have been involved in social movements and protests through history, but even today, the strongest of these movements are mostly offline. We've conducted a landscaping study to see what we could learn about how women-led social movements in other countries are using digital technologies. The next slide, please. The study consisted of a literature review and the development of 8 case studies of social movements in India and the world, using secondary material and interviews with key informants. The grid you can see presents these cases by region and by theme. All of the movements are led by women, and the cases are distributed geographically across India, the global south, and low-income groups in the global north. Today, we're going to discuss a subset of these 4 cases that are using digital technology in substantial ways. So I'll introduce the social movements and then discuss how they've used the digital opportunity, the risks they've encountered, and how these risks have been mitigated. Next slide, please. Argentina is a high-income country endowed with liberal institutions, but this hasn't dented its patriarchal culture. Every year, several hundred women are killed by their partners or ex-partners, and until recently, neither the press nor the government took action. In 2015, a group of urban professional women in the capital lost patience. Are we not going to raise our voices? They are killing us, tweeted one of them. Ni una menos was born. It means not one woman less. Today, Ni una menos is at the vanguard of shifting gender politics in the subcontinent. Next slide, please. Canada might be a first world country and an exemplary democracy, but argue the founders of Idle No More, the colonization by the white settler community continues to this day. In late 2012 and throughout that winter, a group of Indigenous women spurred their communities to remain idle no more. It was time to organize a defense against the state's relentless annexation of land and extraction of natural resources. It was time to get their Indigenous rights behind a flagging eco movement. And the next slide, please. Police brutality towards Black Americans is widespread and persistent. In the city of LA, for example, there are 3 to 4 police shootings a week, 80% aimed at young Black and Latino men. Black Lives Matter declares that the response needed today is to fight, not just for police reform, but for its abolition, to reimagine a world centered on community, a world of care, not cops. Founded in 2013 by 3 women, the Black Lives Matter Global Network grows through local chapters, and the chapters grow through plugging into local activity, much of it with deep roots. Next slide, please. And our last case study for today. Technology controls the lives of more and more precarious workers in America. Can technology also be used to build their collective power? This was the challenge taken up by Co-worker's founders in 2013. Co-worker is an alt-labor organization, building workers' strength in the face of powerful employers like Starbucks and Target, working outside the framework of unions which are struggling to remain relevant. Co-worker provides platform tools, campaigning advice, and mentoring towards a world where worker solidarity and collective action can transfer from one job or location to the next. And the next slide. So in the next 3 slides, we're going to draw on these 4 cases, as well as the wider literature, to talk about the digital opportunity for these movements, the possible pitfalls and risks of digital, and about how these risks were mitigated. So the first statement on the slide: with digital, activists can go direct with their message at very little cost. The network effect of social media means that you can reach people fast, no more dependence on expensive door-to-door canvassing and poster campaigns. Does this mean that legacy media is no longer needed? Our case studies say no. Legacy media, by which we mean the press and television and radio, it's still very important, but something has changed, says a Black Lives Matter member. Social media provides us the platform to tell our story as real, as raw, without the worry of somebody's biases. Through Black Lives Matter, activists are correcting the narrative. For Ni Una Menos in Argentina, it's been less about correcting a narrative than building it. Femicide needed to be denormalized, and for that, public opinion needed to be built first on social media. Coverage in the press and television has been crucial to the success of both of these movements, but the sequencing and the power balance has changed. Activists get their narrative out on social media before the mainstream press engages. The press covers the movement because it has already become newsworthy. Legacy media follows social media. The power has shifted. The second statement on the slide, but digital messaging can also fuel conflict and stifle understanding. If it's easier for activists to get the story out online, it's also easier for their opponents. The risk is a descent into partisan flame wars on both sides. Both sides find it easy to fight digitally and out of context. Deliberation between viewpoints is silenced, empathy fails, and the virtual mobs settle in. Our case studies have all been witness to this, but they have also mitigated the negative impact and even leveraged opponents to become a source of strength. When Idle No More encountered settler trolls opposing their campaign, they decided to assign these trolls to settler collectors, white Canadian supporters who agreed to engage with their settler troll cousins in order to bring these guys around. Ni Una Menos' challenge to Argentina's patriarchal status quo brought it into direct conflict with the powerful Catholic Church, but it engaged its opponents in deliberation and crafted its message to ensure that even provincial conservatives using WhatsApp would come on board. So, while some conflict and backlash is inevitable, it can be mitigated and the discussion can survive. Next slide, please. New kinds of folk participate in digital movements more easily and readily. It's easier to be an activist today. Not only can you participate digitally from the comfort of your phone, you're not expected to sign up to so much ideological baggage. All our case studies are successfully mobilizing new participants. Black Lives Matter has politically engaged a youth earlier cynical and uncommitted. Idle No More has spread political literacy among an Indigenous underclass. Co-worker attracts introverts and marginalized workers who would shrink from having a public role. But as the second statement on the slide says, this brings a mixed bunch of participants who may lack solidarity and commitment. It's often argued that digital is good for mobilizing, but not for sustaining. Participants don't share enough of a collective identity. This is not only because they've come together under a big tent with little in common, but it's also because the digital nature of the movement tends towards clickbait content rather than deeper engagement, which helps to build this shared commitment. But we see that digital social movements can and do build solidarity, even after the event of mobilizing. Black Lives Matter has done just this: mobilize via social media first, dig down in real-world local chapters later. Workers first join co-workers' online petitions, but then become part of a steady network able to tackle unaccountable corporate power anywhere, anytime. Social movements then further mitigate the big tent effect by keeping narrative control with a relatively small group. Ni Una Menos remains an informal movement with no registered institution nor membership, but within it, there are several structured points, by which we mean activist groups whose history and collective identity bind them tightly together. Next slide, please. Digital helps muster collective power to force change where institutions resisted it. Social movements arise because institutions resist the change desired by people. For Black Lives Matter, the institution in question is the police. For Ni Una Menos in Argentina, it is Argentina's judiciary. For Idle No More, it was the neoliberal state and the official body of First Nations. The goal of a social movement may be to galvanize the institution into doing its job, or it may be to replace the institution completely. The role of digital in these efforts goes beyond being one tool among many others, because the digital platform itself can become a new channel of reckoning and redress. When emotive testimony and visual content circulates, it sets off a litany of judgments and denunciations. Perhaps this rage can be channeled towards collective pressure for institutional accountability, but perhaps it can't, and participants are left or even provoked to take justice into their own hands. And the second statement, but the same digital movements may be ill-equipped for institutional and political change. Legal and institutional change is, after all, a long-haul game, which needs strategy and leadership. Some argue that these qualities are lacking in the digital and big tent movements. Could it be that these movements' rejection of institutional redress is linked to their weakness in this regard? As an informal digital movement, Neonamenos is not ideally placed to push for institutional change, but to counter this, it makes a quiet effort to win over conservative public opinion, which governs these very institutions. Since 2019, Black Lives Matter has been breaking into two halves, with one half formalizing into a registered and hierarchical organization, and the other half remaining an affiliation of grassroots chapters. Will the movement prove as adept at working on incremental institutional change as it was at raising the pitch on the street against a racist state? So on the last slide, could we have the last slide, please? I'm just going to finish with, well, second to last, with just a few questions which would be good for prospective digital campaigners to ask who are hoping to set up campaigns in the global south. Is there a single simple issue which confront your campaign and bring everyone together? What offline actions complement your campaign and who's leading them? Can you connect with these? What divisions exist which may have impeded broad campaigns before? And how might you overcome these divisions? The next slide. Is your team resourced enough to maintain the social media presence, to segment and the narrative, adapt the narrative as required, and respond to critical voices? How can you make maximum use of visuals and signifiers, such as using trade colors, logos, etc.? And finally, what is your approach to opponents and folks who consider the campaign irrelevant? Can you reach them to disarm or enlist their support? So that's it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much, Orlando, for those thought-provoking insights into the strengths and weaknesses of using digital to mobilize and organize social movements. It was particularly interesting to hear about how social movements mitigate conflict and backlash by persistently engaging in discussion with opponents, which I think is a sort of ray of hope in these particularly conflicted times. And it was also really interesting to hear about the importance of strong, physical, real-world institutions to realize the potential of digital campaigns and to actually achieve impact. And you've raised some really important questions for women's collectives that are considering using digital in India, because there are as many pros as there are cons, and careful consideration seems in order. Okay, so thank you so much. Next slide, please. We can now move forward into a discussion. Amnesty, it would be great if, since I haven't been following the chat, if you could raise any questions and I can direct them.
Sure, that's absolutely fine. So a number have been answered in the Q&A. There's a question from Michelle Selman Fisher that says, what kind of social pressure can be used to provide more equity for underserved people, women, and children, the differently abled, and the LGBTQA community who are depicted negatively or not at all?
Great. I think I'm going to direct that question to Anita, who works in the area of legislative change and government policy. Anita, could you answer that question?
I'll try my best to answer it. So I do think that when you talk about access to resources, whether it's property, or resources that are about your communicative emancipation, these are mired very much in regimes of both political economy and culture, right? So it's not possible to fix everything through the law, but I think that equality of access is very, very much in many of our constitutions basic right, and therefore I would really think that that has to be recognized. And I'm just trying to read the question to get it with respect to, can I see it on? Yeah, that's the one that's open, right? What kind of social pressure can be used to provide more equity? Yeah. So I think the social pressure is, I do find the possibility of alternative media very compelling in these times. And I think that other scholars who've been part of this discussion have also pointed out that because memes and because of the way in which we express ourselves and a whole lot of things have become part of that world of speech, it is possible to challenge the ways in which socially we could give a different narrative to constructs, to especially about people who are in the margins, people with non-normative sexuality, and also underserved people and the differently abled. The question of depiction is very much, I think, embroiled in questions of culture, and I think it's not really easy to answer, because you really can't take the sledgehammer approach to regulating social media, given the fact that there is so much associated with free speech and the ways in which authoritarian governments also act. It's a complex question, but I think that it's vital to recognize the equality of public participation as a cornerstone principle and as a constitutional guarantee for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anita. Amnesty, are there further questions?
No, that's it. There were a number of questions from Arjun, but I believe Anita's answered everything. And I'm not seeing other questions that have not been answered already.
Okay.
So for those of you that are listening, please, again, feel free to type questions in and we'll chime in as soon as they come through. Back to you, Sarah.
Great. That allows me then to ask questions that I want to ask. Eric, you mentioned that we need to go beyond measuring digital access and use to understand the value that different ties in social networks provide. Could you tell us a little bit more about how we might use social network analysis as a research methodology and tool to understand the relationship between digital adoption and women's social networks in collectives and their social networks outside of collectives, and how those social networks either empower or disempower?
Yeah, sure. I can try. I feel like I could probably spend about an hour talking about this, but I'll try to do it in just a couple minutes at the most. I think one thing to bear in mind about social network analysis is that it allows us to collect very fine-grained data on exactly who people are connected to and what they are communicating across those network ties and how they're communicating across those network ties. So, for example, when we look at a particular woman who's involved in a particular WEC, instead of just asking, do you have a phone? What we would be asking her to talk about is to delineate the sort of myriad of different people that she is connected to, and then really in detail try to understand which of those people is she communicating with largely face-to-face, and probably neighbors, family members, the like. Who is she communicating with through digital, right? So this could be, people who are part of the WEC supporting federation. It could be, other women that are a part of this WEC, and what you can start to observe is the ways in which the presence or absence of these particularly these connections can be linked with opportunities. So I think one of the things that we were seeing that was particularly exciting was just the way in which, especially those two women who were the self-help group organizers, the way that they had been using digital to connect to each other, to connect to some of the key members of the self-help groups that they had organized, and probably most importantly, that they were using it to connect to these women who are from sort of higher caste and higher socioeconomic status positions, who themselves had opportunities. Especially what we saw, which was really cool, was one of the WEC supporting women in the Federation had connections to some people in the fashion industry, and they were helping women who were weavers and who were making jewelry at a local level to then connect and create online an online presence and to sell things online. And this was allowing the weavers in particular to sort of circumvent these middlemen who usually would be sort of, take a very exploitative cut of the profits for themselves, and instead directly connect these women to customers. And this was something that they needed, this scaffolding of these more connected women to help them to do. And so social network analysis allows us to really, quantify these things. So not just sort of see them impressionistically, but to really quantify them. So I think I'll stop there. But like I said, I could probably talk about this for about an hour. So
Thank you so much, Eric. And I think, Michelle, is your question directed at Eric? Is that right? I see a question in the chat, which is, what would you recommend to further enhance their lives based on your research? And I think that is addressed at you, Eric. So, for example, in one of the things that we looked at was expanding social networks and accumulation of financial capital, human capital, social capital. So, Eric, maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about how this expansion of social networks can improve and enhance women's lives. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that we saw was that I think that these self-help groups and the women's empowerment collectives, they can help bring financial resources to women, so that women who may not have access to, let's say, like a smartphone, could potentially get the resources to have a smartphone, because then once they have the smartphone, those smartphones we were seeing were being used to like learn about new stitching patterns, new economic activities. But maybe another even more important piece is that even in these collectives where only one or two women and a self-help group might have had access to a smartphone, I think one of the things that we were thinking about while we were watching this was that those women could then become digital ambassadors. So it would be, if we could design empowerment programs where we showed, how other women were succeeding in economic ventures in other communities, that, so it's like, peer modeling of, these are women like you in a neighboring community who are doing well. What are they doing to succeed? That you could create digital content that could be shared in the context of these self-help groups, by the women who had this greater access. And so really, in a sense, what you're doing then is you're taking this bridging capital idea of what's happening in other social spaces, and you're bringing it into these communities where there's really strong bonding capital, where women can gather and sort of watch content together on a phone. Because the other thing that we saw was that was definitely a normative process, in these lower income communities that we were observing, where the kind of in the way that you think about in traditional media of like families gathered around a television set, what you saw was sort of women gathering around a cell phone, and to watch digital media. And I think that that's really about increasing these networks and leveraging them for these opportunities. And just as I'll end with one last thing, the work that I've done in Los Angeles and then the work that we're doing in India has always been about trying to understand these networks and what is happening organically, so that we can leverage these organic processes in new interventions. So we're not reinventing the wheel and sort of imposing from on high, hey, we think this is what you should do, because we're academic researchers from fancy universities or well-funded, NGOs or whatever, but rather what's going on the ground and how can we augment those processes. And so it's always about trying to understand the naturally occurring empowerment and thinking about how to ramp that up. So it's been an exciting piece of work to get to be a part of.
Thank you, Eric. And I think that brings me to my next question for Ambika and Ayush, which is, so you studied digital groups that have been, set up by women or led by women in India. Do you think, and that are large, thriving, digital groups? Could you say a little bit more about the resources that are required to build successful digital groups, giving examples from some of the case studies you've been writing? And also, if you could mention how these groups sustain themselves. Do they monetize their efforts? Like, how do they sustain this effort? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Sarah. So I think using an example here would be really useful. So one of the case studies we were looking at was a large network of moms groups that is mothers across ages. This was a pan-India group with a sort of wide network. We're talking, lakhs of members across, over 30 cities that they're working in across India, as well as some Indian diaspora in other countries. So there were a lot of things that were striking about the way that they mobilized themselves. So this was largely a volunteer-led moderation network, and the moderation itself was quite complex. So they had people who, it was a federated structure. So they have people who are paid, who are at sort of higher level structures, and then there's a higher level in the structure, and then there's lower level people who are volunteers from within the community. Actually, I'll correct that to say that everyone was sort of within the community, right? So everyone was coming from the set of mothers that were actually participating in this group. And what was really striking in terms of moderation was that they had a very granular and rigid set of guidelines that had to be followed by moderators, but they did use a structure of empowered moderation as well. So there were groups like multimedia content cannot be shared at all because that tends to be spam. So only text-based engagement. People who are trying to sell things can only do that on one day in a week. And these kinds of granular rules that are actually shaping the way the discussion happens on the group. And what they use really well is offline engagement. So they managed to build really strong relationships between people who were not known to each other at all before they joined the network, and this was because of hyperlocal engagement. So the networks only function at extremely hyperlocal levels. So within Delhi, you can only meet other people within Connaught Place, not even other parts of the city. And that meant that there was a lot of engagement within mothers who were living within the vicinity, and they held sort of highly organized events that were earlier offline but then moved to online events during the COVID pandemic, and mobilized resources like bringing in celebrity mothers and having people who were within the community actually organize the event. So if there were resources to be brought to the event, then they would be done by mothers from within the community. So they actually had like a downstream resource mobilization system as well.
Thank you so much for that, Ambika. And I know we only have 2 minutes left, but I just wanted to say, what you've shared just now is so interesting about how this huge collective, digital collective of women that has sort of organically formed around motherhood, how they've figured out, ways to effectively moderate themselves. And I think it's particularly interesting, no sharing of multimedia. I mean, that's almost, you're almost like, huh? But it makes a lot of sense because that is how spam spreads. So it's I think these kind of approaches to moderation that communities evolve themselves, and the rooting of it also in very localized physical real world structures really also highlights what Orlando was talking about in terms of the need to root digital movements and digital campaigns in physical real world communities, and to figure out really pretty, robust processes for handling and mitigating backlash. Because as Anita, really brought to light, the backlash is violent and pretty intense. So thank you all. I think we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciate you all for joining from many different locations around the world. And please do, everybody who's watching and listening, sign up to be part of the Gender and Health Hub. Have a good day or a good evening or a good night. Thank you. Bye, everyone.